This is not just a story about a lion, it's about you, the part of you that once led with strength, but was broken by life, that part of you that was left behind when you needed someone the most. This is the story of rising again, of remembering who you are, even when the world forgets. The sky burned red the day he was born, not with violence, but with the quiet, fiery glow of a setting sun that felt more like a sign than a coincidence. The wind was still, as if the jungle itself paused to witness his arrival. Among the dry grass and shadows of towering trees, a new life came into the world, fragile, trembling, yet somehow already powerful. He wasn't the biggest of the litter. In fact, next to his siblings, he looked small, almost unassuming. But there was something in his eyes, fierce, focused, a fire that didn't belong to a newborn. Other cubs cried out for attention, crawling over one another, desperate for warmth. But he didn't. He stayed still, looking out into the open world as if he already understood it, as if he knew that the world could be harsh, that nothing would be handed to him. He blinked slowly, soaking in the light that filtered through the leaves above. His mother noticed it too, not just his silence, but his awareness, the way he moved, the way he watched. This cub wasn't ordinary. From the very beginning, he was different. As days passed, he grew, not faster, not stronger than the others, but smarter. While his brothers chased their tails and played in the mud, he sat beneath the shade of a thorn tree, watching the horizon. He would stare for hours, alert, listening. When he did play, it wasn't to dominate. He didn't fight to prove himself, but when pushed, when challenged, his strength revealed itself like lightning cracking across a silent sky. It was sudden, swift, and impossible to ignore. He never sought trouble, but trouble knew better than to choose him twice. His siblings often pushed him aside, trying to steal a better place next to their mother. But even then, he never whined. He never begged. He simply waited. And somehow, he always got what he needed. Not because he fought for it, but because the pride slowly began to understand. This cub had something none of the others did. One day, while the other cubs wrestled and laughed in the tall grass, a small bird fell from a low branch nearby. Wings broken, helpless. The others didn't notice. But he did. He walked slowly to the bird, sat beside it, and watched. He didn't try to touch it, didn't try to scare it. He just sat there, quietly, letting it know it wasn't alone. It was the first time compassion had been seen in someone so young. The elders watched from a distance, curious, impressed. They whispered among themselves, "There's fire in that one, but it doesn't burn to destroy. It burns to understand." He wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy, but when he walked, even as a cub, others moved. When he stared, they looked away. And when he sat alone, it wasn't out of weakness. It was by choice. Because even then, he seemed to know that solitude wasn't loneliness. It was preparation. The jungle is cruel to those who hesitate. But he didn't. Every step he took was slow, deliberate. He didn't rush to catch up with the others. He didn't care to be first. But somehow, he was always ahead, mentally, emotionally. Even his mother began to rely on him in small ways, watching how he noticed things others missed. A rustle in the grass, the scent of a snake, the tremble of distant hooves. He wasn't just aware, he was present. The day came when he could no longer stand in the shadows. The pride had grown restless. The reigning alpha, once mighty, had begun to show signs of decline. His steps slower, his breath heavier, his temper shorter. The hunts were fewer, the food scarcer. Tension thickened the air like a storm waiting to break. The younger lions whispered, unsure of what came next, but he didn't whisper. He watched. He waited. And when the time was right, he stepped forward. It wasn't a challenge made out of arrogance. He didn't seek to prove he was stronger for the sake of dominance. He stepped forward because he knew the pride deserved more. They deserved leadership, not control. They needed strength, not rage. And he had earned both the scars and the silence to offer it. The battle was fierce, brutal, raw. The older lion fought like a wounded god, desperate, proud, unwilling to let go of the power that had defined him for so long. But age had caught him, and time had sharpened the one he now faced. They clashed under a dark sky, their roars echoing through the trees, sending birds into the air and silence across the jungle. Blood hit the earth. Dust rose. The pride watched from a distance, breathless. Blow after blow, he stood his ground. He didn't fight with fury. He fought with focus. Every move had meaning. Every strike had patience behind it. He didn't let anger control his muscles. He let clarity guide them. And when the final moment came, when the older lion stumbled and hesitated for just a second, he didn't lunge to kill. He held his ground. He stared straight into the eyes of the former king and let the silence decide. The old lion backed away, eyes low, breath broken. Not because he was humiliated, but because he understood. The torch had passed, and the jungle had made its choice. The next morning, the sky was clear, the air still. He climbed the highest cliff at the edge of their territory. Below him stretched the jungle, wild, endless, alive. He stood tall, chest rising with a calm that carried weight. Then he roared, not in rage, not in conquest, but in declaration, a sound that shook the trees and sent every creature into pause. Not because they feared him, but because they heard him. It was not the roar of a lion claiming power. It was the roar of a king accepting responsibility. From that day on, things changed. He didn't force others to follow. He simply made choices that gave them reason to. He shared food before he ate. He protected the weak before himself. He stood between the pride and danger without a second thought. And because of that, they stood taller too. They hunted better, worked together, trusted each other again. He taught by doing. He led by example. When young cubs asked questions, he answered with stories, not orders. When fights broke out among the youth, he didn't punish with teeth. He taught them patience. When the rains were late and the rivers ran dry, he didn't panic. He guided them to water he had mapped during quieter days. The jungle noticed. The herds moved differently. Predators tread with more caution. Balance returned. There was no throne, no crown, no ceremony, but the pride flourished. Cubs grew strong. Mothers felt safe. The elders rested without fear. His leadership created something rare. Peace, not because there were no threats, but because they were prepared for them. And when danger came, they didn't scatter. They stood together. It became known as a golden era, not because the days were easy, but because the pride thrived through them. They didn't just survive. They lived with pride, with purpose. And at the center of it all stood the lion who never roared to be heard, but whose silence spoke volumes. The one who didn't rule to be feared, but who led to be trusted. He had defeated the alpha. He had earned the cliff. But more than anything, he had become what few ever do. A true king. It started with a look. Not a roar, not a challenge, just a look. A brief glance from a younger lion in the pride, once a quiet observer, now watching with something different in his eyes. Not admiration, not loyalty, but something colder. Calculation. At first, he didn't pay it much attention. Young lions tested boundaries. It was part of growing up. He'd done the same in his time. But this was different. It wasn't just the look. It was what followed. The younger lion began to linger after hunts, offering subtle suggestions about how things could have been done better. He spoke in half questions, letting others fill in the silence with doubt. Do you think we should have taken the other route? Wouldn't it have been smarter to move earlier? No direct challenge, just seeds. Others began to listen, not out of rebellion, but curiosity. They respected their king. He had led them through famine, through drought, through battles no one else dared to fight. But time had passed, and time changes more than just seasons. It changes hearts. The young lion was strong, fast, full of fire, and that fire was beginning to catch. The shift was slow, subtle. Conversations that used to quiet down when he entered now continued. Decisions that were once made with a nod in his direction were now met with second opinions. Lions that had once looked to him as a symbol of certainty now hesitated, glanced toward the younger one for reassurance. It was nothing loud, nothing open, but it was happening, and he felt it. He watched from the edge of the clearing one night as the young lion held court, surrounded by others, laughing, speaking boldly. It was harmless on the surface. But beneath it, there was tension, a shift in balance. He could feel the energy changing, like distant thunder rolling in. He still led the hunts, still stood guard at the boundary, still woke before the others to patrol the territory. But his strength was no longer the only strength. His voice no longer the only voice. The younger lion began walking in his shadow, not to follow, but to learn how to overtake it. What hurt most wasn't the ambition. He understood ambition. He respected it even. What hurt was the memory of who that younger lion had once been. The cub he'd protected during a flood, the one he'd taught to track, to fight, to survive. The one who used to walk beside him with eyes full of trust. That trust was gone now, replaced by something sharper, more self-serving. The jungle didn't speak in words, but it whispered. Through the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, the hush that fell when he approached. There were no accusations, no confrontations, but silence has a sound, and this silence was deafening. He tried to hold on, to stay steady. He reminded the pride of who they were, how far they had come. He led by example, not by force. But even that began to feel fragile. His choices were questioned more openly. The younger lion offered alternatives, not aggressively, but confidently. And the others began to agree, slowly, reluctantly. But they agreed. Respect turned to politeness. Loyalty turned to obligation. And deep down, he knew. He was no longer being followed because they believed in him. They were following him because they hadn't yet decided to stop. One evening, he caught the younger lion staring at him from across the river, not with hate, not even with resentment, but with readiness, as if to say, "I've learned everything I can from you. Now I want what you have." He looked back, steady, unflinching, not because he wasn't hurt, but because he understood something the younger one didn't yet know. Power doesn't come from taking the crown. It comes from bearing its weight. Still, that night he didn't sleep. He lay in the tall grass, watching the stars, feeling the ache of something he couldn't name. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was grief. The grief of being outgrown. The grief of being doubted by those you gave everything to. The grief of betrayal. Not by enemies, but by those you once called family. And as the moon hung low over the jungle, he whispered to himself, not aloud, just in his thoughts, "This is how it begins, not with war, but with distance." And so the distance grew. The change wasn't sudden. It never is. It crept in slowly, like the morning fog that rolls across the plains before anyone notices it. One day, he simply didn't move as fast. His joints ached after a long patrol. His breath took longer to steady after a sprint. Nothing obvious at first, just a little slower, a little more tired. But in the jungle, even a fraction of a second means everything. He still rose before the others, still watched the horizon while they slept. He still walked the border of their land, still chased intruders with a roar that could shake the trees. But beneath the surface, he knew. He wasn't who he once was. His muscles, once carved from strength and survival, now held memories of battles long won. His claws still cut deep, but his body no longer carried the fire of youth. It carried the weight of years. The pride didn't say anything, not directly, but they noticed. The way he fell behind during hunts, the way he needed more time to recover, the way his eyes, once sharp enough to see movement in the distance, now squinted more often, searching harder. They still showed him respect, but it was different. It was the kind of respect you give to someone for what they've done, not for what they can still do. One hunt made it clear. A herd of zebras moved across the northern plain. He took position like he always had, downwind, low in the grass. The others followed. He gave the signal. But when the chase began, he faltered. His legs didn't respond with the same force. The ground seemed harder beneath his paws. His lungs burned quicker. Within seconds, he was left behind. He watched them disappear into the dust, his place in the hunt now occupied by younger, faster lions. They returned later, dragging the kill. No one blamed him. No one mocked him. But no one looked at him the same way either. That was worse. He stood off to the side while they fed. Once, they would have waited. Once, they would have offered him the first bite. But not anymore. Not because they didn't care, but because they didn't think to. He had become part of the background. Still present. Still respected. But slowly fading. The hardest part wasn't the pain in his limbs or the stiffness in his back. It was the silence. The way conversations no longer paused when he entered. The way young cubs no longer followed his shadow like they used to. They followed others now. Lions who still had fire in their bones, speed in their steps. He had become something they looked past, not toward. He tried harder, forced himself into another hunt, even when his body begged him not to. He pushed through exhaustion, through the pain that shot through his side with every leap. He wanted to prove he still mattered, that he wasn't just a memory walking among them. But when he finally brought down a small antelope, panting, trembling with effort, the pride barely noticed. One of the lionesses took it, thanked him gently, and gave it to the cubs. Not with reverence, but with sympathy. And sympathy cuts deeper than any wound. That night, he didn't join them at the den. He lay beneath a lonely tree, staring at the stars through the branches. He remembered when he roared and the jungle answered, when his presence brought silence. Now his absence brought nothing. He wasn't angry. He didn't blame them. Time changes everything. He knew that. He had seen it happen to others. He just never thought it would happen to him. He had given his life to the pride, his strength, his wisdom, his protection. And now, as his body began to fade, he realized something even more painful than being replaced. He was being forgotten. Not all at once, not cruelly, but quietly, slowly. Day by day, his place in the world grew smaller, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He closed his eyes that night, not from exhaustion, but from something deeper. The ache of fading relevance. The fear of becoming invisible in the very world he once ruled. He wasn't just losing strength. He was losing his reflection in the eyes of those who once looked up to him. And that kind of loss, you don't feel in your body. You feel it in your soul. The rain came without warning, thick and unforgiving, pouring from the heavens like the sky itself was weeping. The wind howled through the trees, bending branches and scattering leaves across the jungle floor. The air was heavy, soaked in a tension that couldn't be explained, only felt. Something was coming. He felt it in his bones, in the way the earth seemed to tremble beneath his paws, in the cold that crept into his chest, despite the fire that still lived in his heart. He stood alone beneath a weathered tree, his mane soaked and clinging to his frame. Thunder cracked above, but he didn't flinch. He had seen storms before. He had walked through worse. But this wasn't a storm of weather. It was a storm of fate, and fate had teeth. The younger lion emerged from the shadows, muscles taut, eyes burning not with hatred, but with hunger. The kind of hunger that doesn't just want to win, it wants to replace. Rain dripped from his whiskers as he stared across the clearing. There were no words, no warnings, only silence. The kind of silence that makes your breath catch in your throat. The pride watched from the distance, huddled beneath cover, eyes wide. But no one moved. Not the lioness he had once shielded from a rogue. Not the cubs he had carried on his back, teaching them to pounce in play. Not the warriors who had once stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder. They all watched, and he knew in that one heartbreaking moment he would face this alone. The younger lion lunged with all the rage of youth and ambition. The first blow was fast, cutting across his face with brutal force. He staggered but did not fall. He countered, landing a deep strike along the shoulder, but it lacked the power it once would have had. His breath came harder now, his body slower to react. And the younger lion saw it, smelled it, took advantage of it. They clashed in a blur of claws and fury, the mud beneath them turning red as thunder roared above. But it wasn't a fair fight. Age is the slow thief of strength, and it had stolen more than he realized. Every move felt heavier, every breath burned. He fought with pride, with heart, but pride doesn't protect bones, and heart doesn't shield flesh. A brutal swipe sent him crashing to the ground. The world spun. He tried to rise, legs trembling beneath him. He looked to the pride, his eyes searching for something, anything, a spark of loyalty, a flicker of memory. But there was nothing, just stillness, just eyes, wide and waiting. The final blow came without hesitation, a crushing weight to the side of his head that dropped him to the mud, breathless. He didn't cry out. He didn't plead. He simply lay there, staring up at the dark sky, rain falling into his eyes, washing away the blood, the dirt, and the last of what he once was. The new lion stood over him, victorious, not just in body but in presence. The pride slowly approached him, cautious but willing. They gathered around the new king, not in celebration but in acceptance. The shift was complete. No one looked back. He remained on the ground, chest rising and falling slowly, each breath weaker than the last. Around him the world moved on, the pride he had built, the family he had protected, the land he had defended. It was no longer his. And with him, lying in the mud, broken, forgotten, everything he once ruled slipped quietly into memory. It wasn't the loss of the fight that hurt most. It was the silence afterward. The absence of a single voice saying, "You mattered." Because in that silence, he realized the brutal truth of life in the wild. When you're no longer useful, you're no longer seen. The rain had stopped by morning, but the sky was still gray, heavy and hollow, as if even the sun couldn't bear to witness what remained. He rose slowly from the mud, every limb trembling under the weight of pain and humiliation. Blood crusted over his wounds, and every breath came with a sharp sting. His legs didn't feel like his own anymore. They carried him forward only because they had to. There was no ceremony to his exit. No roar, no farewell. Just the quiet shuffle of a fallen king walking away from the only world he had ever known. Behind him, the pride moved on. The cubs played. The lionesses cleaned their fur. The new king stood tall on the ridge, watching but saying nothing. There was no need to. The silence spoke everything. His chapter had ended, and no one had turned the page with him. He was no longer a part of them, no longer a protector, a leader, or even a memory worth holding on to. He was simply gone. His steps took him deeper into the wilderness, far beyond the land he once claimed as home. The tall grass swallowed him whole. Branches scraped his sides. The wind, Once something he read like a language, now carried no meaning. Just emptiness. The wild was not unfamiliar to him. He had grown up in it, shaped by it, but now it felt different. It no longer whispered guidance or greeted him like an old friend. It felt distant, cold, indifferent. He found shelter beneath a fallen tree, hidden beneath twisted roots and thick vines. There was no warmth, no comfort, only space to lie down and breathe. The kind of breathing that didn't promise tomorrow, just acknowledged that today hadn't killed him yet. He closed his eyes, and the world behind his eyelids was no kinder. Flashes of his fall haunted him. The younger lion's eyes filled with fire. The pride's stillness, the way no one ran to his side. Over and over again, that moment played until sleep, heavy and unwanted, pulled him under. Days passed, or maybe weeks. Time didn't matter anymore. He moved when he had to, drank from dirty pools, ate whatever scraps he could find, half-eaten carcasses left by other predators, small creatures too weak to escape. His body grew thinner, his mane matted and dulled. He no longer looked like the king he once was. He barely looked like a lion. No other pride would accept him. Lone lions were seen as threats or burdens. He didn't have the strength to fight, nor the desire. He avoided confrontation, choosing shadows over conflict. His roars, once thunderous and full of command, were now hoarse whispers that barely reached the trees. He became a ghost of the jungle, not feared, not respected, simply unseen. The herds didn't scatter at his scent. The birds didn't pause their song at his presence. The jungle had already moved on, and so had the world. One night, under a sky filled with stars that refused to look down, he sat on a hill and stared out at nothing. His breath was shallow, his eyes dull, and in that moment the silence was louder than any roar he had ever let loose. He had lost battles before. He had known pain, hunger, even grief. But this was something else. This was being forgotten, not erased by time, but ignored by those still living in the time he once ruled. And somehow that was worse. His mind wandered to the days when cubs ran to him, when lionesses sought his counsel, when the jungle waited for his voice to break the morning stillness. Those days felt like dreams now, soft, far away, and unreachable. He didn't cry. Lions don't cry. But there was something in his chest, something heavier than any wound, something that sat there, unmoving, a kind of silence you don't escape from, a kind of silence that lives with you. Still, he stood, not because he believed in hope, but because standing was all he had left. He had nothing, no pride, no home, no name that echoed, just his breath, just his scars, and the memory of what once was. He was broken, he was bleeding, and he was alone, but he was still walking. The nights were the hardest. They stretched endlessly, each one colder than the last, each one darker in ways that had nothing to do with the absence of light. The stars above blinked indifferently, distant and silent, offering no warmth, no direction. In the past, he would have read the stars like maps, guiding the pride through dry seasons, tracking prey migrations, sensing storms. Now they just stared back, unmoved, uncaring. He was no longer the lion who mattered. He was just another shadow beneath a sky that had forgotten his name. The wind whispered through the trees, and he lay still beneath a crooked branch, too tired to move, too weak to care. Hunger gnawed at his belly like a second set of ribs, and his wounds ached with a rhythm that made it hard to tell whether his heart was still beating. The jungle, once his symphony, had gone quiet. No roars, no calls. Just the slow ticking of time passing with nothing to wait for. Something inside him began to crack, not from pain, but from emptiness. There was no anger left, no pride, no drive, just a hollow space where purpose used to live. He tried to sleep, but the silence pressed too hard against his mind. Thoughts came like ghosts, uninvited and impossible to silence. What was it all for? The battles, the leadership, the sacrifices, the scars. If this was the ending, what did any of it mean? He remembered cubs with wide eyes who once followed his every move, mimicking his walk, asking him questions about strength, about bravery. He remembered the lionesses who trusted him with their lives, who looked to him not just as a king but as a protector, a foundation. He remembered the feeling of standing on high ground, wind in his mane, the world below waiting on his voice. And now, there was no voice, only breath, shallow, ragged, uncertain. He lay there in the dirt and felt something he had never felt before, like something inside was quietly dying, not the body, the spirit, that unshakable thing that had once carried him through every storm, every fight. It was barely there now, like a fading ember at the bottom of a cold fire pit. For the first time in his life, the thought crossed his mind. Maybe this is where it ends. Not with a roar, not with a final stand. Just like this, quiet, alone. But then something stirred. It wasn't loud. It wasn't grand. Just a faint shimmer in the moonlight. He turned his head, slow and tired, and saw it. A small pool of water just a few feet away, perfectly still, untouched by wind or falling leaves. A mirror formed by rain and time. He dragged himself toward it, unsure why. Maybe instinct. Maybe curiosity. Maybe the last flicker of something refusing to go out. He leaned over it, breath uneven, and stared into the reflection. At first, all he saw was a broken creature. Scarred, thin, eyes dimmed by loss. He didn't recognize himself, not the way he used to look, not the way kings were supposed to look. But the longer he stared, the deeper the image went, beneath the dirt, the wear, the wounds. There was something still there. Not strength, not power, but a presence. A truth that had survived everything. He blinked slowly, the way he once did as a cub, sitting under the same stars that now felt so far away. He remembered that fire, the quiet fire that burned without needing to be seen. The fire that said, "You don't stop because you're tired, you stop because you're done, and I'm not done." Something shifted. He didn't roar. He didn't rise like a hero. But something inside stood up, even if his body couldn't. The night didn't get warmer. The stars didn't get closer. But the silence felt different now, less like a grave and more like a womb, a space not of endings, but beginnings. He looked at his reflection one last time. And this time, he didn't see a fallen king. He saw a lion who had walked through death and still had breath left in his lungs. And sometimes, that's all it takes. The morning came quiet, without fanfare. No birdsong, no footsteps. Just the slow exhale of the wind moving through the trees. He stood near the edge of a cliff, the kind of place he used to stand proudly when the world still knew his name. But now there was no audience, no pride, only wind and sky. His body still ached, his wounds still raw, but something inside him had shifted during the long night. Something had refused to die. He looked out at the endless stretch of land, familiar, yet distant. This was no longer his kingdom. And yet, it was still home. The earth hadn't rejected him. The wind still moved around him like it always had, brushing against his fur like an old friend. It didn't ask him who he was. It didn't care what he had lost. It simply accepted him. As he stood in silence, the breeze grew stronger, curling around him, whispering through the tall grass and broken branches. It didn't speak in words, but somehow he heard it. Deep inside his chest, it stirred something ancient. "You were never the king because they followed you," it seemed to say. He blinked slowly, His ears twitched. There was no one there, no voice. But the message was clear, clearer than anything he'd heard in seasons. You were king because you never stopped walking, even when you were alone. The wind wasn't mocking him. It wasn't trying to heal his pride. It was reminding him of who he had always been before the title, before the glory, before the fall. A lion who walked forward, who kept moving, no matter the weight on his back or the pain in his legs. Not because he wanted to be seen, but because he believed there was more beyond the next horizon. He sat down slowly, the cold stone beneath him grounding his thoughts. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel broken. He felt quiet, empty, but in a way that made space for something new. Nature wasn't punishing him. It was teaching him. Not through comfort, but through challenge, through absence, through hardship. He began to move differently after that. Not to chase anything, not to reclaim what he lost, but to learn. He watched the birds build nests high above, delicate yet strong. He observed the antelope, how they listened to the wind, how they sensed danger long before it arrived. He studied the rivers, the way they changed their path not by force, but by persistence. Everything around him, once just background to his rule, now became his teacher. He hunted not to conquer, but to survive. He learned which berries dulled pain, which plants kept insects away. He rested when the sun was harsh, moved when the air cooled. He found new watering holes, not marked by borders, but shared in silence with other wanderers. Lone elephants, aging hyenas, exiled wolves. They didn't speak, but their eyes said the same thing. We're still here. He began to understand that survival wasn't just about strength. It was about awareness, discipline, adaptation. Life wasn't about being at the top. It was about continuing when there was no top to climb. He roared once, not to reclaim territory, but to feel his voice again. It echoed through the valley, not as a call to war, but as a reminder to himself that he still had something to say. And the wind answered, not with words, but with presence, brushing past his face, swirling around his scars as if to say, good, keep going. He wasn't the lion he once was, but in some strange way he had become more present, more aware, more connected to something deeper than power, purpose. And that purpose wasn't built on thrones or roars. It was built in the quiet moments, in the walking, in the learning, in the breath that says, not yet, even when the world says, you're done. And so he kept walking, not because he was trying to return, but because he had finally realized he had never truly left. He no longer looked behind him. The past was there, sure, etched in every scar, hidden in every aching joint, but he stopped searching for it in the faces of passing lions or in the echo of old memories. Something in him had shifted quietly and without ceremony. He stopped trying to be who he once was, the king, the warrior, the voice others followed. That lion had served his time, had fought, loved, led, and lost. Holding on to that version of himself was like trying to catch smoke. It faded every time he reached for it. So, he let it go. And in that letting go, something unexpected happened. He began to breathe easier. The weight of old expectations lifted. The shame of no longer being the king loosened its grip. There was no one to impress, no pride to protect, just the quiet of the jungle and the steady beat of survival. But it wasn't desperation anymore. It was choice. A choice to keep moving, not out of duty, but out of something more honest. A simple will to live, not for glory, just for the day itself. Each morning he rose with the sun, not because he had to, but because he wanted to feel its warmth on his face. He learned the rhythm of the land again, not as a ruler, but as a listener. The way the dew clung to the leaves just before dawn, The way the breeze shifted when rain was coming, the scent of danger in the soil, the distant call of birds that always knew more than they let on. Nature didn't give him answers, it gave him rhythm. And in that rhythm he found his place again, not above it, not outside of it, but within it. He stopped chasing big victories. He found peace in the small ones, catching a rabbit when his legs didn't want to run, finding fresh water after a long, hot walk, watching the moon rise through the trees with no one around and still feeling full. These things wouldn't have meant much to the lion he used to be, but to the one he was becoming, they were everything. Some days were harder than others. Old wounds reopened, hunger gnawed. The solitude at times became a mirror too sharp to face. But even in that pain, he learned. He learned that silence wasn't his enemy. It was his teacher. That loneliness wasn't always emptiness. Sometimes it was space. Space to feel, space to heal, space to grow into something new. There were no crowds to cheer him on, no cubs watching his every move. But he began to carry himself differently, not with the weight of who he was, but with the quiet confidence of someone who knows who they are now. He wasn't rebuilding the past. He was shaping a new path, one that didn't need a crown, just a clear sky and enough strength to walk under it. And he had that strength now, not the kind that makes others bow, but the kind that helps you rise when no one's watching, the kind that finds beauty in stillness, that sees victory not in power, but in peace, the kind that doesn't shout, but speaks in the way you carry yourself, in the way you keep going, step after steady step. There were moments when he'd pause beneath a tree or by a stream and smile, just slightly. Not because something great had happened, but because he was still here, still breathing, still learning, still becoming. And in those moments he felt stronger than he ever had as a king. Because now he wasn't trying to be anyone else, not the warrior, not the leader, not the ghost of his old glory. He was simply himself. And in that quiet, honest truth, he found something that had eluded him his whole life: peace. The air was thick with heat that day, heavy and unmoving. Even the wind seemed to sleep. He had been walking near the edge of a dried-up riverbed, following the tracks of a small herd he never intended to hunt. Just something to do. A rhythm, a habit. His body no longer moved with urgency, only with purpose. And that purpose was simple: stay alive, stay present. But on this day, something stirred the stillness. A sound, high-pitched, frantic, sharp, cut through the quiet. It wasn't a roar, it wasn't a growl. It was the desperate cry of something young. He paused, ears twitching, and turned toward it. The sound came again. Panic, fear, the unmistakable scream of a cub in danger. He didn't think. He ran. His legs, stiff with age, moved faster than they had in seasons. Pain flared in his chest, old scars pulled tight, but none of it mattered. There was no plan, no strategy, only instinct, something buried so deep that even time couldn't erase it. He reached a clearing just in time to see a pack of hyenas circling a tiny lion cub, no more than a few moons old. The cub's fur was matted, eyes wide with terror, trembling against the roots of a dead tree. The hyenas laughed their terrible, hollow laugh, the sound of cruelty without cause. They hadn't struck yet, but they were close, playing, toying with fear. Something inside him ignited. He stepped into the clearing without sound, not a roar, not a growl, just presence. The hyenas paused, turned. One of them snarled and took a step forward, underestimating what stood before them. Maybe they saw his thin frame, his slow movements, the way age had stolen the shine from his mane. Maybe they thought he was just another relic, harmless, weak, done. They were wrong. He moved with a fury they didn't expect. He didn't fight like a lion with something to prove. He fought like one who remembered exactly who he was. Every strike was clean. Every movement filled with precision born of countless battles survived. He didn't waste energy. He didn't roar for show. He acted with purpose, not rage, with memory, not pride. The first hyena fell back, bleeding and howling. The others hesitated. They sensed it now. the weight behind his silence, the fire that had never truly gone out. They didn't understand it, but they feared it. One more charge, and a deep, guttural growl from his chest sent them scattering, tails low, heads down. The clearing emptied and the jungle went quiet again. He stood still, breath heaving, blood dripping from a reopened wound along his side. But he didn't feel pain. Not yet. He turned to the cub. The little one hadn't moved, frozen by fear and awe. He approached slowly, not as a king, not as a stranger, just as one who understood. The cub looked up at him with wide, wet eyes, and in them he saw something familiar, not just gratitude, recognition, not of his name, but of what he carried. He didn't speak. Lions don't need words. He just lay beside the cub for a while, letting their breathing slow together, letting the moment settle. And in that silence, something returned to him. Not power, not glory, but purpose. A different kind, a quieter kind. One that didn't ask to be seen. He didn't save the cub to be honored. He didn't save him to reclaim anything. He did it because something in him remembered the fire, the one that had always burned, before the throne, before the fall, before the exile. The fire that knew what was right and acted without asking for anything in return. As the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the ground, he nudged the cub gently, pointing him toward safety. Then, he turned and walked the other way. No parade, no pride, just a lion with blood on his fur, strength in his stride, and a fire once thought lost now quietly burning again, not for the world to see, but because he finally remembered who he really was. It started quietly, like everything does in the jungle. A whisper carried on the wind, a scent left in the grass, a broken branch near a watering hole, small signs, the kind only the observant notice, the kind that don't shout but linger. Word began to spread among the animals, not in language but in instinct. The old lion, the one they thought was gone, had been seen again, not dead, not vanished, alive, walking. But something was different now. He didn't move like a king returning to reclaim a throne. There was no roar announcing his arrival, no trail of followers behind him, no fights, no claims, just steady footsteps through forgotten paths and overgrown trails. His mane, though faded, still carried the memory of fire. His eyes no longer burned with ambition, but they held a depth that made even the boldest pause. He had been to the edge, and he had returned, not as a ruler, but as something older, something deeper. The young lions, who had only heard stories of him, looked on with curiosity. This wasn't the towering figure their mothers had described, not the mighty king with the thunder in his chest and the world at his feet. This lion was thinner, quieter, marked by time, but still there was something in him that made them step aside when he passed, not out of fear, not out of duty, but out of respect, the kind that cannot be demanded, only earned. The hyenas kept their distance now, not because he posed a threat, but because they sensed the shift. Predators understand power, but they fear wisdom even more, and in him they saw both, not in the way he hunted, but in the way he didn't have to. The jungle somehow made room for him again. He stopped often now by rivers under ancient trees beside herds he once would have stalked, not to control, not to conquer, but to simply be. And that quiet presence began to ripple. The animals didn't gather around him like a court. They simply noticed, the way the wind changed when he was near, the way danger seemed to hold its breath, the way time itself seemed to slow. Some said he had returned from death. Others said he was something else now, no longer a lion, but a spirit in a lion's skin. He didn't care for either version. He wasn't here to be believed in. He wasn't here to be followed. He had no interest in leading again. The fire that once made him a king had become something quieter, something steadier, a warmth, not a blaze. And yet, without trying, he began to change the jungle again. The younger lions fought less recklessly. The elders lifted their heads more often, sensing something they thought had long disappeared. Even the sky, it seemed, cleared more often where he walked. He didn't bring peace. He didn't bring order. He brought a reminder that strength wasn't in dominance but in presence, that wisdom wasn't loud, it listened. He met eyes with the new king once, a silent moment across the tall grass. No challenge, no resentment, just understanding. The younger lion stood proud, powerful, and the old one, standing there alone, nodded, a quiet blessing. Then he moved on, because he wasn't here to replace. He wasn't here to return. He was here to walk, and so he did. Through rains and winds, across broken land and blooming fields, every step a story, every breath a lesson. He was no longer the lion that demanded attention, but somehow his presence made the jungle still, as if even the earth paused to listen when he passed. They called him the Old King now, not in title, but in reverence, a name not carved into stone but whispered through leaves, echoed in the quiet after the storm. Not everyone saw him, but those who did never forgot. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the plains, bathing everything in a golden, fading light. The wind, gentle now, stirred the grass just enough to make it whisper. It had been a long journey, one measured not in miles, but in moments. Moments of loss, of silence, of rediscovery. And now, as the sky burned orange and the air cooled, he stood at the base of the cliff, the same one he had once ruled from, the same stones that had felt his weight when he was young and proud and untouchable. He looked up. It wasn't a decision. It was instinct, a pull, not to reclaim but to return, not to possess but to witness. Slowly, step by step, he began the climb. The path was harder than it used to be. His limbs moved with careful intention now, every step a quiet battle between will and weariness. But there was no rush, no one pushing, no one watching, at least, not yet. The wind picked up as he climbed, wrapping around him like a memory. The stones beneath his paws were cold, rough, and familiar. Each one told a piece of his story. He had once stood here and roared until the sky itself seemed to answer. He had once believed that to be strong meant to be followed, that to lead meant to always be in front. But now he understood. True strength wasn't in being seen. It was in continuing, even when no one was looking. He reached the top just as the sun kissed the horizon, and he stood. Not tall because he was strong, not proud because he had something to prove. He simply stood because he had earned it. Every scar, every lesson, every breath. His mane caught the wind, ragged and weathered. His eyes, though dimmed with age, held something deeper now. Not fire, not fury, but truth. A quiet, unshakable truth. Below him, the jungle stirred. Eyes turned toward him one by one, not because he roared, not because he demanded it, but because something in the air shifted when he reached the top. The new king watched from a distance, still and calm. The cub he'd once saved sat beneath the tree where he had nearly died. The herds paused their grazing, the birds quieted their songs, the jungle itself seemed to hold its breath. And he said nothing. There was no roar, no speech, no show of dominance, just a lion standing on stone with nothing to prove and everything behind him. The silence was not empty. It was full. Full of stories, of pain and survival, of endings and beginnings. He didn't need the crown. He didn't need the throne. The pride didn't need to kneel, and the winds didn't need to carry his name. He stood as one who had lost everything, walked through fire and still returned, not to rule, but to remember. And in that silence, the jungle bowed, not in fear, but in reverence, because strength like his didn't come from victory. It came from the choice to rise after everything had fallen, to stand tall, not for applause, but for the simple, defiant act of standing at all. And so, there he was. No crown, no throne, but still, he stood like a king. You may feel forgotten, like your name was once spoken, once celebrated, but now echoes only in your own mind. The world moves fast, faster than hearts can keep up. People shift, seasons change, and suddenly, the place you once stood feels smaller, quieter, like it no longer remembers who you were. You may feel like you're walking alone, not because you chose solitude, but because no one saw the weight you were carrying. The nights where your thoughts were louder than sleep. The mornings where you rose, not out of strength, but out of habit. where simply getting through the day was a victory no one clapped for. You may feel like the world passed you by, like your time came and then left and no one noticed. But listen closely. The jungle doesn't forget. It doesn't care for noise. It doesn't care for thrones. It remembers those who endured, those who kept walking even when their legs trembled, those who fell but didn't stay down, those who bled but didn't lose their soul, the ones who walked away with nothing left but still walked. Your scars, they are not shame. They are scripture. They are the lines of your survival, written not in ink, but in skin and silence. Every mark on you says, I've been there, I felt that, I survived it. They do not make you less, they make you real. Because kings aren't made in the moment they rise. They're made in the moments they choose not to fall, in the quiet, in the struggle, in the empty spaces where no one is watching and the only voice left is your own. So maybe today, you don't feel seen. Maybe today you wonder if all the fight was worth it. If anyone will ever understand how much it took to keep standing when the weight wouldn't lift. But you must remember this. You're still walking, and that means everything. Even if you walk alone, you walk with the strength of every step you refuse to surrender. Even if no one claps, even if no one calls your name, you move like someone who has faced darkness and didn't kneel. You walk like someone who doesn't need permission to matter, because once you've been broken and built yourself again, the world can no longer define you. The crown isn't what makes you royal. The applause isn't what makes you worthy. Your resilience is, your will is, your story is. So stand where you are, with your scars, with your silence, with your unseen victories, and understand this. You don't need a crown to prove your worth. You already carry it, in your scars, in your steps, in your story. You still walk like a king. As weeks turned to months, the pride grew more active, more chaotic. Cubs tested each other daily. Strength became currency. Roars filled the air, but he still stayed calm. He never needed to prove anything. And yet when danger came, when a wild dog crept too close to the den, he didn't hide behind his mother like the others. He stood between her and the threat. He was still small. He was still learning. But he didn't flinch. He was born under a crimson sky, and the fire in him had never left. It didn't rage. It didn't scream. It simply burned, silently, steadily. The kind of fire that warms, the kind of fire that waits. And everyone in the jungle, even the wind, seemed to know, this cub wasn't just another lion. He was destined. The sun was high the day he set out for his first hunt. The air was thick, dry, and buzzing with tension. He wasn't a cub anymore. Not fully grown either, but something in between. That awkward, dangerous stage where instinct begins to challenge experience. He had watched the adults hunt countless times before, memorizing their every movement, every twitch of muscle, every silent step through the tall, golden grass. But watching was one thing. Doing it was another. His breath was steady as he crouched low behind the others, his ears pinned back, eyes locked on a grazing antelope in the clearing. The older lions moved with precision, each knowing their role. But him? He was still learning his place. He crept forward, careful, calculated, holding back the restless energy building inside him. For a moment he felt the rhythm, the silence, the unity of the hunt. And then, it was time. They burst forward like thunder, the pride exploding from the grass, sprinting toward their prey. He followed, adrenaline surging, paws pounding the earth. But in his eagerness, he made a mistake, a slight stumble, barely noticeable to most, but it threw off the timing. The antelope darted left and the others adjusted smoothly. He didn't. His body hesitated for half a second too long, and in that half second the hunt was lost. They returned empty-handed, panting, frustrated. The older lions didn't speak, but their glances said enough. He had failed, not catastrophically, but enough to feel it, enough to carry the weight of disappointment. As they rested in the shade, he sat apart, silent, staring at the dry earth, heart heavy with the sting of failure. His paw throbbed from a sharp thorn he'd stepped on during the chase, his first scar. A small one, but unforgettable. Not for the pain it caused, but for what it meant. It marked the day he learned that strength alone wasn't enough, that timing, awareness, and patience mattered just as much as power. But he didn't sulk. He didn't whine. That night, while the others slept, he stayed awake, watching the stars, replaying the hunt over and over in his mind, not to punish himself, but to understand. He noticed the moment he hesitated, the way his balance shifted, the slight delay in his reaction, and he promised himself something in the stillness of that night. He would never make the same mistake twice. The next few weeks were quiet. He didn't ask to join another hunt. He watched more, practiced alone in the shadows, stalking birds that flew away long before he got close. But it wasn't about catching them. It was about control, silence, timing. He stalked with purpose, not just hunger. He began to feel the land beneath his paws, understand how the wind carried scent, how the sun's position revealed or hid him. He began to blend in, not just physically, but mentally. Then came another chance. A young wildebeest this time, slower, distracted. The pride moved again, and so did he. This time no stumble, no hesitation. He didn't go for the throat, he went for the flank, pushing the animal just enough to shift its direction into the waiting jaws of an elder lion. The kill wasn't his. The glory wasn't his. But the result was. No one said it aloud, but they knew. They saw. And more importantly, he knew. He had contributed. He had learned. The pride began to treat him differently after that. The side glances were replaced with silent nods. When they rested, he wasn't alone anymore. They didn't invite him to lead, but they started to follow his eyes. Where he looked, they looked. Where he moved, they watched. He didn't roar orders. He didn't push others aside, but when a choice had to be made, when a path needed to be chosen, he stepped forward and others fell in step. He wasn't the strongest. He wasn't the loudest. But he was steady, and courage, he discovered, didn't come from never failing. It came from failing, learning, and walking forward anyway. His scars weren't marks of defeat. They were symbols of survival, badges earned not by dominance, but by resilience. Slowly, without ever demanding it, he began to rise, not because he sought power, but because others began to trust the silence he carried, the kind of silence that speaks louder than any roar, the kind of silence that says, "Follow me," not because I'm above you, but because I've walked through fire and I'm still standing. And that made him more than just a hunter. It made him a warrior,